Hello, I'm Lauren Isaacson, and I'm a market and UX research consultant from Vancouver, British Columbia, on the west coast of Canada. Now, I've known a lot of accessibility proponents in the UX community. I've been working in UX for a few years now. And the conversations I've been hearing from the UX design and the programming area of things, they talk a lot about accessibility and what that means and how to achieve it and how important it is. But I never hear it coming from the research community, or very rarely do I hear it coming from the research community, and I believe that needs to change. Now, before we begin, I just want to thank my friends and accessibility professionals, Mary Elizabeth Sullivan and Glenda Sims, for their valued and significant input. Without them, I don't think I could have made this presentation. We're going to be going over how to understand this world of disabilities, how to view people with disabilities as a market to sell to, the legal implications of disabled exclusion, why we should go about making research inclusive, and then how to go about doing that. Let's start with my experience. Now, my experience with disability is indirect. This is Cherry Ray. She is my neighbor. She has been my neighbor for the last 7 or 8 years. When I first met her, she was a successful fine artist and photographer. She was very open about having ADHD and also about being on the autism spectrum. But soon after she moved in, she changed. She had to step away from art and she focused her energy on gaming. She started streaming on Twitch and she gained a following rivaling her days as an artist. The reason why she had to make that transition is that her health had deteriorated. She was experiencing chronic pain, fatigue. She was having trouble digesting food. She was experiencing failing motor skills and an overall loss of strength. Gaming provided an outlet, a physical distraction. Eventually, she was diagnosed with a rare mast cell and connective tissue disorder. She had to have a feeding tube installed, and she got a wheelchair to aid in building her strength and independence. She's since had the feeding tube removed, and she's doing much better now. Now, while she may not be able to continue as an artist, she's making up for it by fiercely advocating for people with disabilities on social media. She also speaks about accessibility and the importance of it at gaming conferences. She consults with game developers on how to make their games and equipment accessible to people with disabilities. She even does it full-time now for Ubisoft out of Montreal. She's also made me more aware. Having her in my life has made me more aware of disabilities and people with disabilities and the struggles they go through on a daily basis. And I'm very grateful for that. What I'm trying to get at is that a disability is not a novelty experience. Everybody has a disability experience, whether it be direct or indirect. What we need to confront is, what is your definition of disability? Are you able to see people you know as having a disability? So let's go about understanding what disabilities are. Now, disability is a complicated label, but categorizing it makes it easier to understand. There are physical disabilities. These affect mobility, dexterity, and include the loss of limbs. There are visual impairments. And there's a wide spectrum of visual impairments. There are very few people who can't see anything at all, and it can be caused by a lot of different factors. Hearing impairments are much the same way. A person doesn't have to be deaf in order to be hearing impaired. There are also cognitive disabilities. This includes neurological impairments such as epilepsy. They can also affect the ability to learn and process information, such as autism. And they can also be psychiatric and include ailments such as stress, depression, bipolar disorder, and anxiety. Then there are disabilities associated with speech. Now, it used to be that people who worked in the accessibility field didn't really worry about speech, but now with a lot of voice interfaces, this is something they have to realize and accommodate for. So speech impairments are people who have trouble communicating by talking. This can mean anything from not being able to talk at all to having a stutter. And when we're thinking about all these categories of disabilities, people don't necessarily fit under one single category. They often qualify under multiple categories. And we also need to recognize that disabilities are not always visible. They're sometimes not obvious at all. So when we're thinking about that variation within categories, we can look to vision as an example of that. So it can be anywhere from one end of the spectrum, which is colorblindness, which usually involves men, usually between 1 out of every 9 men experience colorblindness, and that usually involves around not being able to tell the difference between red and green. There's also low vision, which can just be people who need glasses. There's legal blindness, which means that you can't really differentiate between shapes. You kind of see a vague shape, but you're not able to really tell what it is. And then there's complete blindness, where you can't see anything at all. And then there are innate visual impairment, which are visual impairments that people are born with. And then there are acquired visual impairments, and those are impairments that people acquire later on in life. And the boundaries between all these are blurred. It's not necessarily one thing or the other. I really appreciate how Microsoft views disability, and they view it as a continuum. On one end of the continuum, there's permanent disability. And when we're thinking about in terms of mobility and dexterity, that can be from the loss of an arm. And then someone can be temporarily disabled from a broken arm, or they can be situationally disabled from carrying a large bag of groceries. When Microsoft solves for one of these situations, they solve for all of these situations, which is why it's really convenient to be able to use a phone with one hand. It was designed that way. It was designed that way for these types of situations. So let's talk about the market. Unfortunately, it can't just be about doing the right thing. There has to be some kind of financial incentive. So let's recognize that people with disabilities are a huge market. They make up over 20% of the global population and have a significant disposable income. In fact, they rival or even greater than that of a lot of the niche markets that our clients want us to pay a lot of attention to and learn about. Now, I have an asterisk by the people with disability population, because people may technically qualify as disabled, but they may not self-identify that way. Disability is a personal issue, and some people may view themselves as disabled while other people may not, and that's okay. It's their business. But because of that self-identification issue, we may not have exact numbers around what the exact population of people with disabilities is. We should also be thinking about their friends and loved ones. So as we all know, word of mouth affects spending behavior. People support companies which break down rather than create the barriers affecting people that they care about. So when we think about brands that we know and we enjoy, one brand that really comes to mind is OXO. So OXO was created to facilitate somebody with severe arthritis. And so people are able to see people with severe arthritis, see them handle a different device, and they're like, oh, that works for them, whereas a plain old device doesn't. That's great. I should use that. And they do use it, and they're just like, this is really comfortable. This works better than the other things I use. And that's why it becomes a popular brand, because they see how it works for the other people in their lives that really need it, and how other things don't work for those people. We should also recognize that the market is guaranteed to increase with age. So 2% of toddlers have a disability. That increases to 12% of school-age children. Then that jumps to 21% of people over the age of 15. And then that jumps way up to 50% of people over the age of 65. The older people are, the more likely they are to be disabled and therefore benefit from some form of accommodation. And as people who are researchers, as people who study statistics and demography, we should all know that the general population is getting older over time. So this is a growing market that we should be looking at very carefully. There are also legal implications to not being accommodating to people with disabilities. Many countries have accessibility laws. The intent of these laws is to remove barriers to people with disabilities from participating in society. They apply to products and services that are publicly available. That could include websites, products, services, buildings, restaurants, cafes, cars, like you name it. If it can't be made accessible to someone with a disability, then it could be in violation of an accessibility law. Doesn't matter if what you are working on is public or if it is private. If it is meant to be enjoyed by the population at large, it should be accessible. So lawsuits under the Americans with Disabilities Act for accessibility in websites have been happening since 2008, but they are increasing. So as you can see, there was a big jump between 2017 and 2018. It's massive. So when we're thinking about this is a big deal, and this is why companies are starting to pay a huge amount of attention to whether or not their websites are accessible to people with disabilities. Now, while the numbers may be leveling off, that doesn't mean they're going down. And while they may still be processing the numbers from 2020, the trends show that it is still plateauing, but again, not going down. So we need to be very aware of this. Once you learn about accessibility and what it means, what it entails, and what are the signs of accessibility, you start to see the lack of it everywhere. This could include high tables and bench seating at restaurants. It could include public restrooms that are difficult to get to or too small, or you can't or don't have enough room for a wheelchair to make a turn in, or mirrors that aren't tilted down so that people in wheelchairs can see themselves. It can include sidewalks without cutouts. It could include building entrances with just stairs and no ramps. We don't have to think about these things because, well, we don't have to. And that by itself is the very definition of privilege. So let's change that. I would like to think of doing inclusive research as an opportunity, not a kindness. There are many sectors and situations that can benefit from involving people with disabilities in both generative and evaluative research. If there is anything to learn from the last few years in media and current events, it's that visibility matters. It is difficult to build or account for scenarios that you don't know about or haven't seen. We need to start bringing those cases to the forefront of our process so that we're able to encounter them early so that we can accommodate those things. Let's look at healthcare. People with disabilities are often excluded from healthcare research, even though they are the greater consumers of healthcare services. That doesn't even make any sense. That's ignoring a $750 billion a year market and a quarter of all healthcare expenditures, and that's just the US. Tech companies are also getting on board. Not only do they understand that non-accommodation is a liability, they recognize that solving for these edge cases makes their systems better for everyone they seek to serve. So when I was working at a Canadian telecommunications company, this was something that I suggested that the designers and program managers do when they were doing their usability testing. They were completely on board. So the designers especially, they've been trying to practice accessible design. They wanted to be able to see it in action. They wanted to be able to see these edge cases, these stress cases. What happens when they actually have to use what they've designed? Does it work as intended? Should they be doing something different? It's one thing to have an academic knowledge of what accessibility is. It's another thing to see it in action. So they definitely want to see these things in the field. Governments need to be accountable to all of their constituents. Ignoring the disabled community can cause huge backlashes during policy implementations. Let's take straw bans, for example. The able-bodied people saw banning straws as no big deal. It's kind of a convenience. We don't really need straws in order to drink liquids. It's just a nice thing to have. But the disabled community mobilized and vocalized how much they depend on straws to drink fluids. For some people, it's not a convenience. It's a matter of survival. They need a straw in order to drink. So in return, straw bans were softened. So now you can go up to the counter, you can ask for a straw. While it may not be perfect, it works better than not having anything at all. So there's that. We have a lot of clients who are looking to innovate into the next great product, and finding creative workshop or research participants can be key to that next innovation. People with disabilities tend to work their creative muscles far harder than able-bodied people. Working on the next great snack package is small potatoes compared to what they encounter on a daily basis. Take humorist David Rakoff, for example. His disability was acquired, meaning he wasn't born with a paralyzed arm. The nerves in his arm died after being treated with aggressive radiation for cancer. He had to learn to adapt and got creative in order to keep living his life the way he wanted.
If I retained anything from dancing, it's a physical precision that certainly helps in my new daily one-armed tasks. They're the same as my old two-armed chores. They're not epic or horrifying. Some of them don't even take that much longer, but they're all to one degree or another more annoying than they used to be, requiring planning, strategy, and a certain enhanced gracefulness. Oral hygiene. Hold the handle of the toothbrush between your teeth the way FDR or Burgess Meredith playing the Penguin bit down on their cigarette holders. Put the toothpaste on the brush, recap the tube, put it away. You really have to keep things tidy because if they pile up, you'll just be in the soup. Then reverse the brush and put the bristles in your mouth. Proceed. Washing your right arm. Soap up your right thigh in the shower. Put your foot up on the edge of the tub and then move your arm over your soapy lower limb back and forth like an old-timey barbershop razor strop. Grating cheese. Get a pot with a looped handle, the heavier the better. This will anchor the bowl that you want the cheese to go into. Put the bowl into the pot. Now, take a wooden spoon and feed it through the handle of the grater and the loop of the pot, and then tuck the end down into the waistband of your jeans. Clean underpants are a good idea. Jam yourself up against the kitchen counter and go to town. Special kitchen note. Always, always, always have your bum hand safely out of the way, preferably in a sling, since you now have a limb that you could literally, no joke, cook on the stove without even knowing it. Which makes me feel not like a freak exactly, but, well, actually like a freak.
An Australian study by the Centre for Inclusive Design showed that adding inclusive elements later can increase development costs by 10,000 times in comparison to a product designed to be inclusive from the very beginning. So, remember those numbers I showed you earlier about all the lawsuits that are happening in the United States? They're also happening globally. They're just settled differently and we don't have numbers on them. So when we think about the fallout from those lawsuits, it's not just about the penalty that the companies have to pay. It's also about now being confronted with all of the additional costs and timelines of having to make an inaccessible product suddenly accessible. And that is significant. So I've made my case of why we should be making research inclusive. Let's talk about how. Now, I'm just going to be giving you enough information to make you feel capable. It's going to be like going down a playground slide. You're going to sit there and just go, oh, it's no big deal. This is totally easy. I can do this. But then you realize that slide goes off a cliff. And that's me. I am flailing. I am struggling. I am doing my best. I am falling off that cliff. But that's okay. That's exactly where I should be. There is way more to learn, and we're all going to get overwhelmed quickly. We need to think of this as the start of our inclusive research journey. We all have a lot more to do. So we can make research inclusive by minding our manners, designing research inclusively, being accommodating, and being willing to modify. So let's talk about minding our manners. When we talk about people with disabilities, we can try putting the person first. There is identity language, which describes what somebody is. Then there's person first, which describes what a person has. It's autistic versus a person with autism. It's blind versus someone with blindness. It is diabetic versus a person with diabetes. It is paraplegic versus a person with paraplegia. Person-first language is intended to put the person before the disability, recognize their humanity before their condition. And it's meant to be polite. And as far as safety is concerned, if you just want to play it safe, go with person-first language. That's the better way to go. But there are no hard and fast rules. There are people out there that prefer identity language. So ask, how do they prefer? What would they like? And adjust accordingly if they state another preference. Now, there is some basic etiquette when interacting with people with disabilities. Speak directly to the person, not their interpreter or their companion, and make sure that you have their attention before you talk. Ask before helping them. They may not want your assistance. Don't touch them, their aides, or their service animals without their permission. A lot of times they see those things as parts of their body, and you wouldn't touch someone without being very intimate with them or having their permission to do that. So it's kind of the same. Be patient when you are talking with someone who has trouble communicating. They're going to get there. They just need the room and the space to do it. Just give them that space. And if you don't know, which you most often do not, just ask. So how do we design our research to be inclusive? Let's start with recruiting, because every study begins with recruiting. How do we get people with disabilities into the room to participate in our study or to answer our surveys? You can go it alone if you have the time, but not the budget. And there's lots of options on social media and through advocacy groups. So there's hashtags on Twitter and Instagram. So first one up there is A11Y. That is the condensed hashtag for accessibility. Accessibility has 11 letters, so that's why it says A11Y. And then there are the less creative ones like disability and disability awareness and inclusion. And it just goes on infinitely from there. So that's one source. Then there are Facebook groups. So there's disability support group, hidden disability scope, and there's infinitely more and even more specific than that. Just need to do some searching. Then there's Reddit. Now I've come to the conclusion that there is a Reddit thread for just about everything, and disabled groups are no different. Then there are advocacy groups. So when you're reaching out to advocacy groups, be sensitive when you are working with these types of organizations. They may not be interested in helping you with a single project and then never hearing from you again. They're usually more interested in having a relationship with you. So if you're not prepared to invest in that relationship, you may want to reconsider reaching out to an advocacy organization. For recruiters, I've worked with traditional recruiters and I've worked with specialists, and both have their pluses and minuses. Now, traditional recruiters are so accustomed to excluding people with disabilities from their studies that people with disabilities in their database tend to be on the mild or non-existent side. So this can be changed with time and understanding expectations, but we need to give that time and pressure. Specialists, on the other hand, can provide people with severe disabilities, but they're not used to being flexible or properly screening and preparing their participants, so you'll have more work to do with them. But those specialist recruiters are better able to maintain ongoing relationships with advocacy organizations and support orgs as well. So that's a plus there. If you run research and usability tests on a regular basis like I have, you'll want to try to save the interview with the person with the disability for last. At that point, you'll know the guide through and through, and you'll be able to be more flexible during the session. If you're working with people with varying levels of disability, you'll want to save the more challenging ones for last for the exact same reasons. For screening for people with disabilities, I usually use these two questions. Would you describe yourself as a person with disability? Yes, no, I'm not sure. And if yes, please define your disability. So I prefer to let people self-identify. Like I said before, their disability is their business, and while they may technically have a disability, they may not want to self-identify that way, and that's fine. So let them describe and define how they are disabled and work from there. So when I first started doing this, and I just would ask those first two questions, the first person I got, she had lupus and 2 knee replacements. Now, I don't argue with the fact she was disabled. She absolutely was. But I was trying to test a mobile phone app, and she wasn't disabled in a way that would matter to a test for a mobile phone app. So I started asking these questions. So does your disability make any of the following tasks difficult? And I was looking out for using the internet or using a smartphone app. If they answered yes to either of those, then they would qualify as the person with a disability for my study. And that helped a lot. That really narrowed it down. Using these types of questions can be good not only for when you are seeking people specifically with disability, but also as a heads up. I mean, what if there is somebody who wants to participate in your group who has a disability and you don't know it? If you're able to identify them ahead of time, you can meet them ahead of time, figure out what they need in order to fully participate in your group, and work from there. You're going to want to give people enough time and information to prepare. I usually send instructions with the screener, which I'm sure most people do. Now, what you don't want to use is use scanned documents, because a scanned document is just a picture. You can use Microsoft Word in order to do an accessibility check on a digitally created document, or you can use Adobe, which also has an accessibility checker for PDFs. You want to allow for a way to provide consent that doesn't require a signature. So thinking check boxes for agree, yes, I agree to the terms and the consent and stuff like that. That's another way to do that. So you'll also want to try and provide your instructions in multiple formats, written, audio, and visual. So if you can do all 3, that's great, you get a gold star. But if you can do 2 out of 3, that's good too. Some people respond better to written instructions, other people need to hear what to do, and others prefer videos or pictures showing them what to do. Simple line drawings and symbols can really help people with cognitive disabilities. IKEA instructions are a great example of this. You can put together a dresser without them communicating a single word in any language. That's kind of incredible when you think about it. How can we potentially do that with instructions for participants? So we can use iconography and short statements. So here is an example. It's just a very rough example of what you can do. So we have a clock showing that we're discussing time. Then we have a computer, so that's what you're going to need. You're going to need a computer, strong Wi-Fi, a quiet space, earbuds, and then using a Chrome browser, you'll go to this link. So that's a rough way to do it. I expect you to get creative and build on this, but it's a good place to start. So let's talk about surveys, because how can we have a random representative sample if we're excluding people with disabilities? You'll want to ask your survey platform vendor if the platform is WCAG compliant. So you're looking for 2.1a and AA WCAG standards compliance. What you're looking for specifically is finding out if the underlying technology is accessible. You will be surprised how often it is not. I ask this a lot, and I'm only just starting to get answers that say, yes, it's on our roadmap, or yeah, we are mostly accessible, and these are the way we are not accessible. And that's a big improvement compared to what I've seen in the past. We need to put pressure on vendors to make their platforms accessible. It starts with us as the buyers of these technologies. Now, a lot of survey platforms offer customization options. That makes the survey programmers the last line of defense for accessibility. Now, you can use an online tool to make sure that your color contrast between text, links, and buttons are strong enough. For screen readers to detect something as related, such as a set of questions and answer options, they have to be close together. Because if they're not, then a person using a magnifying function can get lost if there's too much white space. Make sure that error messages make it clear how you expect people to format their answers to your questions, and that error messages appear above the question so that assistive devices recognize them as connected. Remember, words and pictures are better together, so use words with symbols and symbols with words to assist with navigation. When you are programming your survey, you're going to want to play it safe if you can and use simple question formats. Sure, it's fun to program sliders and drag and drops on the chance that they'll boost your engagement. But what if by doing so, you're excluding that 6% of the population that can't use a mouse when it comes to the computer? They navigate only by using the keyboard. That's not good. Then also check with your provider to see if any question types and features aren't compatible with assistive devices. So for qualitative research, we also need to think about being WCAG compliant, and that goes for online and offline. We want to ensure that the research software that we're using is WCAG compliant. Ask participants what assistive aids they will be using during the session and check with your provider to see if the platform is compatible. You'll save yourself a world of hurt if you know this in advance. If you are conducting the research in person at a facility, you will want to expect to pay a higher incentive because it's harder for people with disabilities to make the journey to the facility. Do not just take the facility's word that they are accessible. You will want to ask for specific questions and proof. So my neighbor Cherry, she's like anybody else. She wants to go to a new place, try a new restaurant. And so she and her partner, they'll make a reservation and they'll ask the host, can your restaurant accommodate a wheelchair? Invariably, the host will always say, yeah, of course we can. Please, we can't wait to see you at 7 o'clock tonight. Then they'll get there and they'll see stairs to get in. They'll see an overcrowded restaurant layout where she can't get through with her wheelchair. And they'll have to turn around and go someplace else. And that sucks. Now, do I think that the host is ever being malicious? No. I just think the host doesn't know any better because they don't have to know any better. And I wouldn't expect any different from a hosted facility. It's kind of the same thing. But if you can go remote, do that because it's just so much easier that way. So when I say ask for proof and confirmation that a facility is accessible, these are the kind of questions you want to ask. So for accessibility for wheelchairs, you're going to want a minimum clear width for a wheelchair is 36 inches for a hallway and 32 inches for a doorway. The minimum clearance space for a T-shaped turn of 180 degrees is 36 inches in all directions. Also ask, are the tables high enough and are they height adjustable? An accessible table has a surface height of no more than 34 inches and no less than 28 inches above the floor. It needs at least 27 inches of knee clearance and it must be provided between the floor and the underside of the table, so 27 inches from the floor to the underside of the table. Ask if the hallways are wide enough. What about the bathroom? Is the bathroom accessible? Where is it? Are there elevators to take instead of stairs? What about automatic doors? Where are they? How do they get to them? Is there accessible parking? What about public transit? Is that close by as well? Those are all things that matter to people with disabilities. You can document some of those things before they arrive and put them in the instructions. Things like how to get to the right bathroom, which doors are automatic and how to get to them, and where the nearest parking spots for people with disabilities. So, remember, when we are considering research software or research facilities, it can be qualitative, it can be quantitative, we should be asking about legal and WCAG compliance. Research service providers will start taking this seriously when we start asking them to take them seriously. So it's up to us. We are the ones with the money. We are the ones making the decisions. We are the ones they listen to. So ask for things to be accessible. What about the stimuli we use during research sessions? How do we make that accessible? Remember, not everyone can read your words, and not everyone can see your pictures. So combining the two using captions, alt text, and descriptions, as well as videos and audio of text, can be better for everyone. Caption your videos and enter alt text for your images. Don't just caption the words, caption the sounds as well, like applause or laughter, or creepy music. That all matters to the effect of the stimuli. People who can't hear may consider sign language to be their native language and written English to be their second language. This may mean that they don't have advanced reading comprehension. Keeping your language plain and easy will make it easier for those people, but also immigrants who don't consider English to be their primary language. Some people are very sensitive to different stimuli. If anything has sudden loud noises or flashing lights, you may want to give your participants a heads up. That way, if that's something that they can't do, because that can really knock somebody out if they're not prepared for it and they're very sensitive to those things. If you give them a heads up, that gives them the option to opt out so that they don't have to deal with that. And that's a good thing to do. How do we be more accommodating? So first off, let's just recognize that we're not superhuman and we shouldn't be expected to be. So recognize your limitations. Are there disabilities that you as a moderator can't accommodate? Now, for myself, I don't know sign language. Therefore, I can't do research with people who have a hearing impairment and can't communicate with people who hear. So I either need to farm that out to someone who is fluent in ASL, or I need to hire an interpreter to help me moderate the session. Is any of the tech not compatible with assistive devices? Now, in usability testing, often prototypes are created with software not compatible with screen readers, meaning we can't test prototypes with people who are blind. That's not great, but if we recognize that, we can test it with people with disabilities who aren't blind. Are any of the facilities that we're going to be using inaccessible? If we can't accommodate someone in a wheelchair, we need to make that known in the screener so that we don't have an uncomfortable moment if they show up and they can't even get in the building. What about their limitations? What can we do to meet them halfway? If they have a communication impairment, shorten the discussion guide to only what you absolutely need answers for. If they have a visual impairment, can you create alternatives to visual stimuli, such as audio stimuli or anything else? If they have trouble getting around, offer to go to them if it has to be in person, or use video chat. I remember at the telecommunications company, they were testing messaging for home automation. And they really wanted to talk to people with disabilities, and they're just like, oh, but I don't know how we're going to get them to the office in order to talk to them. And I'm just like, why don't you just go to them? And they were like, we're shocked. And they just looked at me and they're like, we can do that? And I'm just like, yeah, you can do that. You can go to them and see their homes and how they use home automation. Isn't that a great idea? They were thrilled. They thought that was awesome, that that was even on the table. So give it a shot. It could be very exciting. Also be a good host. So provide or exchange contact information in compliance with privacy laws. It's good for you to be able to reach them if they start to run late. It's great for them to be able to reach you if they're having trouble getting to the facility. You also want to be way more aware of your routine when you're interviewing people who are severely disabled. So be careful about what you share during report building to avoid coming across as ableist, or what you share at any time during the session. So, for example, usually when I'm doing report building, I'll talk about how I took up running and how I found a way to do it that doesn't make me feel like I want to die. And first time I started doing this, one of the people that I interviewed, he had severe cerebral palsy. He was in a wheelchair, and he had a lot of trouble getting around. So running, me talking about running, wasn't really going to work all that well. So I had to react fast, and so I started talking about the TV show that I was binging on at the moment that I was really enjoying, and we were able to talk about media that way, and that worked pretty well. We also need to think very carefully about how we approach the subject of their disability during the session. Unfortunately, we do not have good vocabulary around talking about disability with someone who is disabled. It can be a minefield. So, oftentimes, you don't have to directly address the subject of their disability. You can just talk about their experience, and that can be enough. If you do have to directly address their disability, just be very cautious about the terms and how you talk about it and how you talk about it with them. Just be very gentle and very careful, and just ask a lot of questions about what is good and what is bad when you are having that conversation. We also need to be more willing to modify. So this is our last pillar. Have a backup plan. So plan for all the potential events you can foresee. We already use floaters. That's just standard practice when we're doing in-person research, is using floaters. Just in case somebody doesn't show up. But what about jerry-rigged platforms as a backup in case the platform we're using isn't working for people? So, maybe they don't use whatever research platform you're using and they can't log on to it, but they use Zoom and FaceTime and Hangouts all the time. So why don't you just use one of those? See what happens. Test the platform you're going to be using with a free trial version of a screen reader to ensure that it's compatible. Or have that ready to go in case you're doing an in-person usability test and the person you're doing the test with isn't bringing their own devices. Get ready to change on the fly. We're all getting used to this, and there will be events that we cannot foresee. Stay agile and flexible, and find ways to make it work despite the circumstances. Should also be allowing for research to go long. Research sessions can be exhausting, even for the most able-bodied people. Allow for enough time between sessions to go overtime if you have to. Give lots of chances to take breaks in between topics so that people can regain their composure, have a personal break, get some water, have a bathroom break, whatever they need to do, and then get back to business after. So, to wrap up, inclusivity is really part of the zeitgeist right now. Companies are being forced to reconcile with being inaccessible after the passing of new laws and all the lawsuits that I mentioned earlier. Now, we as researchers rarely get the opportunity to do something that is both good for the business and just plain good, period. We should be embracing this. In fact, I'd like to go a step further. I think we should be normalizing this. This should be a part of our regular practice. But remember, this is hard. I expect to be in a constant state of failure. And I don't expect any different for you. And you shouldn't be expecting anything different from yourself. But I think it's really important that we keep trying. And I really hope that you will join me in that effort. So, thank you. That's me. Please reach out. I'd love to have a chat. And these are our wonderful sponsors. Thank you so much for having me today. And now I'm here to answer your questions.